Welcome to the Sleep Society, where tonight we travel back into the world of ancient Egypt, a civilization so long-lasting that it endured for more than 3,000 years. Along the Nile, people built great pyramids, raised vast temples, and created one of the most remarkable cultures in human history. In this video, we will gently explore the lives of pharaohs, workers, priests, and ordinary families, while uncovering the beliefs, monuments, and mysteries that still fascinate the world today. There are many more exciting facts waiting for you in this journey through ancient Egypt, so sit back, relax, and if you enjoy calm history like this, please subscribe to the Sleep Society. For thousands of years, the Nile River was the quiet center of Egyptian life. Long before the pyramids rose over the desert, and long before the names of famous pharaohs were carved into stone, the river was already shaping the world that would become ancient Egypt. In a land where most of the surrounding region was dry, harsh, and difficult to farm, the Nile created a narrow ribbon of life. Its waters flowed from the south to the north, eventually emptying into the Mediterranean Sea, and along its banks, the Egyptian world slowly took form. Villages appeared near the water, fields were planted in the dark, fertile soil, and generation after generation learned to depend on the river for nearly everything. The Nile did much more than provide drinking water. Each year, its flooding renewed the land. When the waters rose and then withdrew, they left behind rich silt that made farming possible. This natural cycle allowed Egyptian communities to grow grain in large quantities, and that stable food supply became one of the main reasons Egyptian civilization could last so long. In many other parts of the ancient world, unpredictable weather could ruin harvests and create constant instability. In Egypt, the Nile brought a rhythm that was more dependable. It did not remove all danger or hardship, but it gave the people a foundation on which they could build a remarkably durable civilization. Because of this yearly pattern, Egyptian life became closely tied to the seasons of the river. The flooding season was followed by the growing season and then the harvest. Farmers, officials, builders, and priests all lived within this repeating natural order. The river did not simply support the economy, it helped shape the Egyptian way of thinking. The regular return of the flood suggested a world governed by order, balance, and renewal. These ideas became deeply important in Egyptian religion and culture. The people of ancient Egypt believed that order had to be protected against chaos, and in many ways, the Nile itself seemed to prove that this order was real. Every year, life returned from the waters. Over time, communities along the Nile grew larger and more organized. Small settlements developed into regional centers, and those regions eventually became part of larger political units. Historians often divide early Egypt into Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. This sounds strange at first because on a modern map, north is usually thought of as up and south as down, but the names come from the flow of the river. Upper Egypt was closer to the river's source and higher in elevation, while Lower Egypt was the northern delta where the Nile spread into many branches before reaching the sea. These two lands had their own identities, traditions, and local rulers for a long time before they were brought together. One of the most important turning points in Egyptian history was the unification of these two regions. Tradition credits this achievement to a ruler often called Narmer, who is sometimes identified with the legendary Menes. Although the details remain partly uncertain, The basic idea is clear. At some very early point, a powerful king succeeded in bringing Upper and Lower Egypt together under one rule. This unification laid the groundwork for the Egyptian state. It meant that the Nile Valley and the Delta could be governed as one kingdom, with a central authority strong enough to organize labor, collect resources, defend the land, and project royal power across a large territory. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define ancient Egypt for centuries. The king, later called the pharaoh, stood at the center of the state. He was not seen as an ordinary ruler. Egyptian kingship was bound closely to religion. The pharaoh was understood as a sacred figure, someone who maintained the balance of the world, honored the gods, and protected the land from disorder. In practical terms, the pharaoh relied on administrators, scribes, local officials, priests, and laborers to govern the kingdom. But in Egyptian thought, the ruler was far more than a political leader. He was a link between the human world and the divine order that sustained it. As the kingdom became stronger, Egypt entered what modern historians call the early dynastic period. During these centuries, many of the institutions that would define Egyptian civilization began to take shape. Royal tombs became more elaborate. Administrative systems became more advanced. Writing emerged as a crucial tool of power. Religious symbols became more formalized. Even at this early stage, Egypt was already showing the traits that would later make it so recognizable. Deep respect for tradition, strong central authority, monumental building, and an intense concern with death, memory, and the afterlife. Writing was one of the great achievements of early Egypt. Egyptian hieroglyphs are now among the most famous writing systems in history, but in the beginning, they were practical as well as symbolic. Writing allowed the state to keep records, track goods, mark ownership, preserve names, and communicate authority. Scribes became highly valued because literacy was a specialized skill. In a world where most people did not read or write, the ability to record language gave enormous power. A written order, a carved royal name, or a funerary inscription could preserve identity and authority long after a person had died. In this way, writing fit perfectly into Egyptian culture, which cared deeply about permanence and remembrance. The early kings of Egypt did not build the great stone pyramids that would come later, but they already invested heavily in tombs and burial practices. Death in ancient Egypt was never treated as a simple ending. From very early times, Egyptians believed that part of the person could continue after death, provided the right rituals were carried out, and the body was protected. This belief gradually led to increasingly elaborate tomb construction and funerary customs. A tomb was not only a place to bury the dead, it was also a place to sustain them, remember them, and prepare them for continued existence in the next world. These early developments reveal something essential about ancient Egypt. It was a civilization that tied everyday survival to cosmic meaning. Farming, kingship, writing, religion, burial, and the landscape itself were all connected. The Nile gave life, but the Egyptians did not see life as random. They saw it as part of a larger order. This order had to be maintained through proper rule, proper ritual, and proper respect for both the gods and the dead. That way of thinking would remain visible through every stage of Egyptian history, from the earliest dynasties to the age of the great pharaohs. In time, Egypt grew wealthier and more confident. The state gained the ability to command labor on a vast scale. Resources flowed toward the royal court. Craftsmen became more skilled. Quarries were exploited. Sacred centers grew in importance. The foundation had been laid for one of the most extraordinary periods in ancient history, the age of pyramid builders and mighty kings. But before that age fully arrived, Egypt had already accomplished something remarkable. It had turned a river valley into a unified civilization with a clear identity, a sacred kingship, and a vision of order strong enough to endure for millennia. That endurance is one of the most astonishing facts about ancient Egypt. Many civilizations rose and fell quickly, their power lasting only a few centuries or less. Egypt, by contrast, remained recognizable across an enormous stretch of time. Languages evolved, dynasties changed, foreign rulers came and went, and religious practices shifted. Yet the civilization preserved a strong sense of continuity. The roots of that continuity were planted in these earliest centuries. The Nile's rhythm, the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, the sacred power of kingship, and the growing systems of religion and administration all created a structure that proved unusually resilient. So when people picture ancient Egypt today, they often imagine the finished grandeur, pyramids, golden masks, colossal statues, and vast temple walls covered in carved hieroglyphs. But all of that began with quieter things. It began with villages by the river. It began with mud, reeds, fields, and boats drifting along the Nile. It began with the patient observation of water and seasons. It began with people realizing that this narrow green valley could support not just survival, but order, memory, beauty, and power. In that sense, the first chapter of ancient Egypt is not really about stone monuments at all. It is about the long, slow creation of a civilization from the dependable gift of a river. When the first Egyptian rulers looked across their land, they were not yet looking at the famous world we know from museums and documentaries. They were looking at possibility. They were looking at a kingdom still in formation, still gathering its symbols, still defining its gods, and still learning how to turn local traditions into a lasting state. What followed would become one of humanity's most memorable civilizations, but its earliest strength came from the simple fact that the Nile allowed people to stay, to grow, and to imagine permanence in a world where permanence was rare. And so the story of ancient Egypt begins with water, soil, and time. It begins with the quiet certainty that after the flood, life would return. From that certainty came agriculture. From agriculture came stability. From stability came power. And from power came the monuments and legends that would one day astonish the world. Before Egypt became the land of pyramids, it was the land of the Nile. And that was enough to begin one of the greatest civilizations in history. As Egyptian civilization grew stronger, its rulers began to imagine power on a scale the world had rarely seen before. Villages had become towns, local traditions had been woven into a larger kingdom, and the authority of the king was becoming more sacred and more visible with each generation. Over time, this growing power found its most famous expression in stone. The age of pyramid building did not appear suddenly, but when it arrived, it changed the visual identity of Egypt forever. Even now, thousands of years later, the pyramids remain the first image many people think of when ancient Egypt is mentioned. Yet behind those immense monuments was not only royal ambition, but also careful planning, religious belief, and an organized society capable of extraordinary cooperation. Before the Great Pyramids of Giza were built, Egyptian kings were buried in structures known as mastabas. These were flat-roofed tombs made of mud brick or stone, with sloping sides and underground burial chambers. Mastabas were important because they reveal the earlier stage of Egyptian tomb architecture. They were already connected to the belief that death was not an end, but a transition. The body had to be protected, offerings had to be brought, and the memory of the dead had to be preserved. Over time, tombs became larger and more elaborate because rulers wanted to secure their afterlife more completely and to display their power more clearly. In Egypt, burial was never only private, it was also political, spiritual, and symbolic. A great turning point came during the reign of Djoser, a king of the Third Dynasty. He is closely associated with one of the most important architectural achievements in ancient history, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. This monument was designed by Imhotep, who is remembered as a brilliant architect, official, and scholar. Instead of building a traditional mastaba, the builders stacked several mastaba-like layers on top of one another, creating the world's first monumental stone pyramid. The result was unlike anything that had existed before. It was not yet the smooth-sided pyramid that later generations would perfect, but it marked the beginning of a new idea. Stone could be used not just for small structures or decorative elements, but for enormous royal monuments meant to last forever. The Step Pyramid complex was more than a tomb. It included courtyards, shrines, walls, and ceremonial spaces. In other words, it was a complete sacred landscape, built to serve the king in death just as the palace had served him in life. This tells us a great deal about Egyptian beliefs. The pharaoh was not expected to disappear after death. He was expected to continue, transformed into a divine figure who still required ritual attention and who still played a role in maintaining cosmic order. A tomb, then, had to be prepared as a functioning eternal residence, not simply as a burial place. That idea would remain central throughout Egyptian history. After Djoser, pyramid building continued to develop. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom experimented with new forms and techniques, learning through both success and failure. One of the most interesting examples is the bent pyramid of King Sneferu. Its unusual shape, changing angle partway up, shows that the builders were still refining their methods. Nearby stands the Red Pyramid, also associated with Sneferu, which is often considered the first successful smooth-sided pyramid. These monuments reveal that the pyramids were not the result of a single burst of inspiration. They were the product of decades of experimentation, engineering, and adaptation. Each structure taught the Egyptians something new about weight, balance, stone cutting, and design. Then came the Great Pyramids of Giza, perhaps the most famous monuments ever built. Constructed during the Fourth Dynasty, they were raised for Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The largest of them, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, was once covered in polished white limestone casing that reflected sunlight brilliantly. Today its outer casing is mostly gone, but originally it would have looked even more dazzling than it does now. To ancient viewers, it must have seemed almost unreal, a mountain of geometric perfection rising from the desert edge. It was not only large, it was precise. Its alignment, proportions, and construction still inspire admiration, even in a modern age of cranes, engines, and digital measurement. The question of how the pyramids were built has fascinated people for generations. Many modern myths have suggested impossible or mysterious explanations, but the real answer is far more impressive. because it depends on human skill and organization. The pyramids were built by large labor forces composed of workers, craftsmen, engineers, haulers, stonecutters, and administrators. These were not enslaved masses driven pointlessly toward death, as older popular stories often claimed. Evidence suggests that many workers were supported by the state, housed near the construction sites, fed in large numbers, and organized into teams. Their labor may have been seasonal in part, especially during times when the Nile's flooding limited farming work and allowed laborers to serve on royal projects instead. This system reveals the remarkable strength of the Old Kingdom state. To build a pyramid, Egypt needed more than stone. It needed food distribution, transport systems, record keeping, skilled supervision, and ideological unity. The king had to command enough authority to gather immense resources from across the land and direct them toward a single monument. Quarries had to be managed. Boats had to move materials along the Nile. Workers needed shelter, tools, and medical care. Scribes had to keep records. Priests and officials had to ensure the rituals surrounding the royal burial were properly observed. The pyramid, then, was not merely a building. It was a visible expression of the whole Egyptian state working in coordinated form. At the heart of pyramid building was religion. The pyramids were closely linked to the sun and to the divine destiny of the king. Egyptian rulers were often associated with the sun god Ra, and the shape of the pyramid may have symbolized rays of sunlight descending to earth or a cosmic ramp helping the king ascend to the heavens. The details of meaning could vary over time, but the central principle remained clear. The pyramid helped ensure the pharaoh's transformation after death. By preserving the body, housing the burial, and serving as the focus of ritual offerings, it supported the king's continued existence in the next world. In Egyptian thought, that continued existence mattered not only for the king himself, but for the stability of the cosmos. The pyramid complexes also included mortuary temples, causeways, and valley temples. These connected the burial monument to ongoing ritual life. Priests brought offerings, recited prayers, and maintained ceremonies for the deceased king. This was essential because the afterlife was believed to depend on continued nourishment and remembrance. In Egypt, memory had power. To speak a name, to present offerings, to keep a tomb in use, all of this helped sustain the dead. The pyramid was therefore part of a larger sacred system, not an isolated structure abandoned after burial. It stood at the center of a network of activity meant to bridge the worlds of the living and the dead. The workers who built the pyramids lived lives far removed from royal splendor, yet their role in Egyptian history was immense. Archaeological discoveries of workers' villages have revealed details about their food, health, and labor conditions. Bread and beer formed important parts of the diet, along with onions, fish, and meat in some cases. Injuries were treated. Teams had names and identities. There was pride, as well as hardship in the work. These communities remind us that the pyramids were built by real people whose hands shaped every block and every passage. Their achievement was collective. Though the monuments honor kings, the labor behind them belongs to thousands of ordinary Egyptians whose names are mostly lost. The pyramids also tell us something about the Egyptian view of permanence. In many cultures, great buildings are meant to impress the living. In Egypt, they were also meant to defeat time. Stone was chosen because it endured. The king's name was carved because memory had to be secured. The monument rose above the landscape so that future generations would continue to see it and know that this ruler had existed, ruled, and crossed into eternity. This desire to endure is one of the most moving aspects of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians knew that human life was fragile, but they refused to let fragility have the final word. Through architecture, ritual, and inscription, they attempted to make life continue beyond death. Yet the age of pyramids was not only an age of triumph, it also revealed the immense cost of centralization. Monumental construction required huge concentration of wealth and labor. Over time, the balance of power within Egypt shifted. Local officials gained influence, and the strength of the central monarchy weakened. The Old Kingdom eventually declined, and the great era of pyramid building faded. Later kings still built tombs and great monuments, but the classic pyramid age had passed. Even so, its legacy never disappeared. The pyramids remained symbols of sacred kingship long after the political system that produced them had changed. What makes the pyramids so fascinating is not just their scale, but their stillness. They do not seem rushed. They do not feel accidental. They rise with a kind of silent confidence, as though they were built for a world in which patience and eternity mattered more than speed. In that sense, they capture something essential about ancient Egypt itself. Egyptian civilization moved through long stretches of time with a deep respect for continuity. It invested in monuments not for a season, but for ages. The pyramids are the clearest expression of that long view. They were built not to last a lifetime, but to stand beyond lifetimes. For the people who lived under the shadow of those monuments, the pyramids must have shaped the imagination of the land. They reminded everyone that the pharaoh was not merely a ruler of the present. He belonged to a sacred order, stretching between earth and sky, life and afterlife, memory and divinity. To serve the kingdom was, in some sense, to serve that order. Even those who never entered the royal court would have understood that Egypt was a civilization where stone, ritual, and kingship were joined together in a way unlike anywhere else. So when we think of ancient Egypt as the land of pyramids, that image is true, but incomplete. The pyramids were not isolated wonders standing outside society. They were the products of a civilization already rich in belief, administration, craft, and agricultural stability. They could only exist because the Nile fed the people, because officials kept records, because workers organized themselves into teams, because architects learned from earlier experiments, and because the Egyptians believed that death was a passage worthy of immense preparation. The stone mountains of Giza are therefore not just monuments to kings. They are monuments to the entire structure of Egyptian life at its height. And in the calm desert light, they still seem to hold that ancient ambition. They still speak of permanence, of sacred power, and of a civilization that refused to think small. They remind us that ancient Egypt was a world where even death inspired creation on a monumental scale, and where the desire to endure could be carved into the earth itself. As the centuries passed and the age of the Great Pyramids faded, ancient Egypt did not disappear. Instead, it changed, adapted, and entered new periods of strength. The civilization that had already proven it could organize vast labor and build for eternity now turned more and more toward another form of greatness: the temple, the god, and the pharaoh as living ruler. If the pyramids were the most famous symbols of royal death, the temples of Egypt became the great symbols of royal life, worship, and divine connection. These sacred spaces were not only places for prayer, they were centers of economy, ceremony, politics, memory, and cosmic order. To understand ancient Egypt fully, it is not enough to look only at the tombs of kings. We must also enter the world of priests, processions, offerings, incense, and towering temple walls covered in carved stone. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of Egyptian life. The gods were not distant figures who existed only in stories. They were believed to be active forces within the world itself. The Nile, the sun, the sky, fertility, kingship, chaos, and protection all had divine dimensions. Different cities often honored different gods most strongly, and over time some deities rose to greater national importance than others. Among the best known today are Ra, the sun god, Osiris, associated with death and rebirth, Isis, linked with magic, motherhood, and protection, Horus, the falcon god, connected to kingship, Anubis, guardian of the dead, and Amun, who became especially powerful in later periods. Egyptian religion was not fixed in a simple way. It was a large and flexible system in which gods could merge, share roles, or be interpreted differently across time. This complexity was not confusing to the Egyptians in the way it may seem to modern readers. Egyptian religion was less concerned with strict consistency and more concerned with sacred presence, ritual continuity, and symbolic truth. A god could be worshipped in animal form, human form, or a combination of both. A deity could also have several names, several local traditions, and many layers of meaning. What mattered most was that the proper rituals were maintained, and that the relationship between gods, ruler, and land remained balanced. In that sense, Egyptian religion was deeply practical. It was not only about belief, it was about keeping the world in order. One of the most important ideas in Egyptian thought was ma'at, a concept that is difficult to translate with only one English word. It can mean truth, balance, order, justice, and proper harmony all at once. The Egyptians believed that the universe functioned correctly only when ma'at was upheld. The pharaoh had a special duty to defend it. Priests supported it through ritual. Officials supported it through administration and law. Ordinary people participated in it through proper behavior, respect for the gods, and attention to social duties. Opposed to Ma'at was chaos, which could take many forms: disorder, falsehood, rebellion, famine, invasion, or cosmic danger. In Egyptian thinking, life itself depended on maintaining balance against these forces. The temples of Egypt were built as places where this balance could be renewed again and again. To modern visitors, a temple may appear to be a grand public monument, but in ancient Egypt, its inner spaces were often restricted. The most sacred areas were entered only by priests, and sometimes the king. At the heart of the temple stood the sanctuary, where the image or sacred symbol of the god was kept. This was understood not as a decoration, but as a real point of divine presence. Each day, priests performed rituals that treated the god almost like a living royal being. They opened the shrine, presented food and drink, burned incense, dressed the divine statue, recited hymns, and purified the space. These acts were not symbolic in a casual sense. They were necessary duties that kept the bond between divine and human worlds active. Because the gods were believed to sustain Egypt, temples became some of the most important institutions in the land. They owned fields, employed laborers, managed workshops, and stored wealth. A great temple could function almost like a small city. It had scribes, treasurers, bakers, brewers, herdsmen, craftsmen, guards, and priests of many ranks. This means that religion in Egypt was never separate from economy and governance. A temple did not simply receive offerings. It produced, distributed, and managed resources on a large scale. The state supported the temples, and the temples in turn reinforced the sacred legitimacy of the state. Among the most magnificent temple centers in Egyptian history were Karnak and Luxor, both associated strongly with the god Amun in the city of Thebes. Karnak in particular grew, over many centuries, into a vast and complex sacred site, with pylons, courts, obelisks, columns, chapels, and processional routes, added by many rulers. It was not built all at once according to one plan. Rather, it developed layer by layer, with each pharaoh trying to leave a mark. Walking through such a place today, one can almost feel the weight of accumulated kingship. Every wall and column seems to say that Egypt was renewed again and again through building, inscription, and ritual performance. The columns of these temples are among the most memorable features of Egyptian architecture. Some were carved and painted to resemble papyrus plants or lotus blossoms, linking the sacred architecture to the natural world of the Nile. Others rose in massive rows through great halls, creating a sense of rhythm and shadow. Temple walls were covered with carved reliefs showing gods, kings, offerings, battle scenes, and ceremonial acts. These images were not random decoration. They served religious and political purposes. They recorded the king's piety, his victories, his gifts to the gods, and his role as protector of Egypt. To carve such scenes into stone was to make them permanent and effective. Once again, Egypt expressed power through endurance. The pharaoh's place within religion remained central. Egyptian kings were not worshipped in exactly the same way as the major gods, but they were regarded as sacred rulers who participated in the divine world. In life, the pharaoh served as chief mediator between gods and people. In death, he joined the divine order more fully. This meant that even temple rituals carried royal significance. When priests offered food or incense to a god, they often did so in the name of the king. When monuments were built, they proclaimed that the ruler had constructed them for the glory of the deity and the stability of the land. In this way, religion and kingship were tightly bound together. A weak king endangered order. A pious and powerful king strengthened it. Festivals brought another side of Egyptian religion into view. Though the deepest temple spaces were restricted, large public processions allowed ordinary people to participate in sacred celebrations. During certain festivals, the statue of a god might be carried out of the temple in a ceremonial boat or shrine, accompanied by music, chanting, offerings, and ritual movement through the city. One famous example was the Opet festival, in which the god Amun traveled between Karnak and Luxor. These events were moments of joy, spectacle, and renewal. They reminded the people that the gods were not hidden forever behind walls. At special times, divine presence moved visibly through the world. The gods of Egypt were also closely tied to stories of death and rebirth, and no story was more important than that of Osiris. According to Egyptian tradition, Osiris was killed, restored, and became ruler of the underworld. His son Horus overcame disorder and claimed rightful kingship. This myth touched many layers of Egyptian thought. It explained royal legitimacy, gave hope for life after death, and connected the cycle of death and renewal to both nature and the human soul. The Nile's flood, the growth of crops, and the rebirth hoped for in the afterlife all echoed this larger pattern. In Egypt, the world was never understood as static. It was orderly, but it was an order sustained through repetition, ritual, and renewal. Priests played an essential role in this system, though their status could vary. Some were full-time temple officials, while others served in rotating periods. Their duties included purification, recitation, offerings, and care for sacred spaces. Knowledge of ritual language and proper procedure was highly valued. A mistaken ritual could be serious because sacred order depended on precision. This may be one reason Egyptian civilization developed such a strong attachment to preserving formulas, inscriptions, and traditional forms. Repetition was not dull to them. It was protective. To repeat what had been done correctly before was to strengthen the world against chaos. And yet within this long tradition, Egyptian religion also had moments of surprising change. One of the most dramatic came under the pharaoh Akhenaten, who tried to elevate the worship of the Aten, associated with the sun disk, above the traditional gods. He moved the royal court, changed artistic styles, and promoted a striking new religious emphasis. For a time, Egypt seemed to be turning in a new direction. But after his reign, many of these changes were reversed, and the traditional cults were restored. This episode is important because it shows that Egyptian civilization, though deeply conservative, was not completely motionless. New ideas could emerge, but lasting acceptance depended on whether they fit the larger structures of Egyptian life. Religion also shaped the private hopes of ordinary Egyptians. People prayed for health, fertility, protection, and justice. They wore amulets, made offerings, and invoked deities in daily life. Household religion existed alongside temple ritual. Magic, too, was not sharply separated from religion in the modern sense. Spells, protective objects, and sacred words were part of how people defended themselves against danger. In a world where illness, childbirth, flooding, and death were constant realities, divine protection mattered deeply. Ancient Egypt may appear monumental to us, but it was also intimate. Beneath the towering columns and colossal statues were countless human concerns: fear, grief, hope, family, illness, and the wish to be safe. This is one reason Egyptian religion remained so powerful for so long. It spoke both to the grandeur of kingship and to the vulnerability of ordinary life. It explained the movement of the sun, the power of the Nile, the fate of the dead, and the duties of rulers. It provided ceremonies for the temple and comfort for the home. It linked the local and the cosmic, the personal and the political. Few civilizations integrated religion into daily existence as completely as ancient Egypt did. When we look at the surviving temples today, it is easy to focus only on their size, but their true greatness lies in what they reveal about Egyptian thought. These were not empty stone shells. They were engines of continuity. They helped maintain the relationship between gods and land, pharaoh and people, life and afterlife. They embodied the Egyptian conviction that order had to be renewed constantly through action, memory, and reverence. Just as the pyramids expressed the eternal destiny of kings, the temples expressed the living rhythm of a world sustained by sacred care. So after the age of the pyramids, Egypt entered not a lesser phase, but another kind of magnificence. It became a civilization of towering sanctuaries, divine festivals, sacred processions, priestly ritual and deeply rooted cosmic order. In the shadow of the temples, day after day, offerings were made and hymns were spoken so that the world would continue as it should. And for generation after generation, that ancient rhythm endured, carried forward by stone ceremony and the belief that balance itself was holy. Beyond the temples, monuments, and royal inscriptions, ancient Egypt was also a land of ordinary routines, familiar worries, and daily work. It is easy to imagine Egypt only through its greatest surviving achievements, as if the entire civilization existed inside tombs and stone sanctuaries. But most Egyptians lived far from the splendor of the royal court. They rose with the light, worked according to the seasons, cared for children, prepared food, repaired tools, carried water, and tried to build stable lives within the rhythms of the Nile. In many ways, the true strength of ancient Egypt rested not only on kings and priests, but on the countless unnamed people whose labor sustained the civilization year after year. For most Egyptians, the village was the center of life. Houses were usually made from mud brick, a practical material shaped from the earth itself. Stone was reserved mainly for tombs, temples, and monuments connected to the gods or the dead, while ordinary homes were built from materials that served immediate needs rather than eternity. These houses could vary in size depending on wealth, but many were modest and functional, designed to provide shade and protection from the heat. Roofs might be used as workspaces or sleeping areas during hot nights. Inside, furnishings were simple by modern standards. There were mats, stools, chests, pottery jars, woven baskets, and tools for grinding grain or preparing food. Life was not luxurious for most people, but it was often organized with care and routine. The Nile determined much of that routine. Egyptian farmers lived according to the river's annual cycle, which shaped the agricultural year. When the Nile flooded, fields were covered with water, and rich silt spread across the land. When the floodwaters withdrew, the soil was ready for planting. Farmers sowed crops such as wheat and barley, which were essential for making bread and beer, two of the main staples of the Egyptian diet. Vegetables, flax, dates, figs, and other crops were also important, and livestock such as cattle, goats, sheep, ducks, and geese contributed to daily life as well. In this sense, Egypt's daily existence remained deeply agricultural, even when the civilization was at its most grand and urban in appearance. Bread was more than food in ancient Egypt. It was a foundation of life. Grain had to be harvested, stored, ground, mixed, and baked, and this process required steady work. Beer was equally important, not merely as a luxury, but as a normal part of the diet. It was safer than uncertain water sources in some circumstances, and provided nourishment as well as refreshment. To modern ears, a civilization sustained by bread and beer may sound unusual, but in Egypt, these were practical and essential foods. Meals for ordinary people might also include onions, leeks, beans, lentils, fish, and sometimes meat, though meat was less common for poorer households than for the wealthy. Food varied according to region, status, and circumstance, but the basic effort of feeding a family was one of the great ongoing realities of Egyptian life. The work of farming was demanding. Fields had to be plowed, sown, irrigated, weeded, and harvested. Tools were relatively simple, and labor was physical. Oxen might help pull plows, but much still depended on human effort. Irrigation channels had to be maintained carefully so that water could be directed where it was needed. A poor harvest, could bring hardship, while a strong one could mean security for the year ahead. Though the Nile was generally reliable, Egyptian life was never completely free from risk. Too little flooding could damage crops, and too much could also create difficulties. So beneath the image of stable abundance, there was always the need for management, adaptation, and effort. Craft workers formed another important part of Egyptian society. Potters, carpenters, metal workers, weavers, jewelers, leather workers, and stone carvers all contributed to the life of the civilization. Some worked in villages and towns, serving ordinary needs, while others were attached to temples, palaces, or state workshops. The quality of Egyptian craftsmanship could be extraordinary. Furniture, tools, cosmetics containers, linen, statues, painted coffins, jewelry, and small decorative items reveal a people with a strong eye for design and material skill. Even practical objects were often made with elegance. This is one of the quietly remarkable features of ancient Egypt. The civilization did not reserve all beauty for the grandest monuments. It also expressed beauty in everyday objects shaped by human hands. Among the most important figures in Egyptian society were scribes. Literacy was limited, and the ability to read and write gave access to status and opportunity. A scribe could keep records, copy texts, register goods, calculate taxes, and support the machinery of the state or temple. Because administration was so central to Egyptian civilization, scribes were deeply valued. They appear often in Egyptian art, seated cross-legged with papyrus and writing tools, calm and observant, figures of knowledge rather than force. For families who could manage it, training a son as a scribe offered a path away from the hardest physical labor. Egyptian texts sometimes praise the scribal life by contrasting it with the exhaustion of farming or manual work. Whether such praise was exaggerated or not, it reflects the prestige attached to education and record-keeping. Women in ancient Egypt occupied a position that has often drawn interest from historians because, in some respects, they appear to have had more legal and economic standing than women in many other ancient societies. They could own property, inherit, manage goods, and engage in legal matters. This did not mean that men and women lived as equals in every sense, nor that Egyptian society lacked hierarchy or gendered expectations. Daily roles were often strongly shaped by tradition, with women deeply involved in managing households, raising children, preparing food, weaving, and supporting family life. Yet the documentary evidence suggests that women were not invisible in legal or economic terms. In royal life, this could be seen even more clearly, as queens and royal women sometimes held immense influence, with figures such as Hatshepsut, later ruling as pharaoh in her own right. Children in ancient Egypt learned early that life involved work, obedience, and participation in the household. Some played with dolls, balls, or simple toys, and images from tombs show lively scenes of games and family life. But childhood was also shaped by labor and vulnerability. Infant mortality was high, and many families would have known grief. Those who survived were gradually drawn into the patterns of adult society. Boys might learn farming, trade skills, or scribal training depending on their family's position. Girls learned domestic responsibilities and household skills. Family was therefore not only emotional but practical. It was the unit through which knowledge, property, labor, and survival passed from one generation to the next. Clothing in Egypt reflected both climate and status. Linen, made from flax, was the most common fabric, especially because the heat favored light garments. Men often wore kilts or short wrapped garments, while women wore long linen dresses or robes. Wealthier people could afford finer linen, jewelry, cosmetics, and elaborate wigs. Appearance mattered in Egyptian culture, and grooming was taken seriously. Combs, mirrors, ointments, perfumes, and cosmetics were all part of life, especially among those who could afford them. Eye makeup, for example, was not only decorative, it may also have helped reduce glare and protect against irritation. The care given to appearance fits the broader Egyptian interest in order, presentation, and proper form. The household was also a religious space. Though temples dominated public worship, ordinary people lived with their own small acts of devotion. Protective amulets, images of gods, spoken prayers, and household rituals were part of everyday existence. People sought help for illness, childbirth, fertility, and protection from danger. They feared misfortune, sickness, and unseen threats, just as people do in every age. Ancient Egypt may seem distant because of its hieroglyphs and monuments, but in daily emotion, it was not so different from the world now. Parents worried for children, families hoped for security, workers sought fairness, people wanted health, food, dignity, and some measure of peace. Of course, Egyptian society was not equal. It was strongly hierarchical. At the top stood the pharaoh and royal family, followed by high officials, priests, military leaders, and wealthy landholders. Beneath them were scribes, craftsmen, farmers, laborers, and servants. There were also enslaved people in certain periods, especially connected to war or foreign capture, though Egyptian society was not defined by slavery in the same way as some later empires. Status affected diet, housing, clothing, education, and access to power. The monuments of Egypt were built in a world where inequality was real and visible. Yet even within that unequal society, cooperation and interdependence mattered. Farmers fed officials. Officials organized labor. Craftsmen supplied temples. Priests performed rituals believed to protect the whole land. The civilization functioned because its many levels were bound together. One of the most revealing places for understanding daily life is Deir el-Medina, the village of the workers who built and decorated royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom. Evidence from this settlement gives historians unusually detailed insight into wages, disputes, family life, religion, and labor. These workers were skilled specialists, not ordinary peasants, and their community shows a world of contracts, complaints, absences from work, neighborhood tensions, and personal devotion. Through such evidence, ancient Egypt becomes more human and less distant. We begin to hear not only the voice of kings carved in stone, but also the quieter voices of workers managing ordinary life under extraordinary conditions. Leisure existed too, though it depended on class and circumstance. Music, dancing, storytelling, board games, hunting, boating, and festivals all formed part of Egyptian life. The game of senet, for example, was popular and seems to have had both recreational and symbolic significance. Banquets among the wealthy included food, drink, musicians, and perfumes. Festivals connected communities with the gods and gave rhythm to the year beyond agricultural work. These moments of enjoyment matter because they remind us that ancient Egypt was not lived entirely in labor or solemn ritual. People also sought pleasure, companionship, and beauty. They laughed, celebrated, and rested when they could. Health and medicine in ancient Egypt combined practical observation with religious or magical ideas. Egyptian healers knew a good deal about wounds, fractures, symptoms, and remedies, even if their understanding was limited by the science of the time. Medical papyri preserve treatments involving herbs, bandages, oils, and procedures, alongside incantations or sacred formulas. Once again, Egypt did not sharply separate the physical from the spiritual. Illness could be treated with both practical care and ritual protection. For ordinary people, survival often depended on whatever knowledge and help were available within the household or community. Perhaps the most important point about daily life in ancient Egypt is that it created continuity. Kings changed, dynasties rose and fell, and monuments were built across centuries. But the basic routines of sowing, harvesting, baking, weaving, recording, repairing, raising children, and caring for the dead continued across generations. This continuity gave Egyptian civilization its unusual endurance. The pharaoh might symbolize order at the highest level, but order also lived in homes, fields, workshops, and village paths. It lived in repeated tasks done well enough to keep the world going. So when we picture ancient Egypt, it is worth pausing before the monumental and remembering the ordinary. The grandeur of temples and tombs was supported by kitchens full of grain dust, by hands weaving linen, by fishermen on the river, by scribes hunched over records, by mothers caring for children in mud brick houses, and by farmers watching the floodwaters with hope and concern. The civilization was not built only by rulers who dreamed of eternity. It was also built by families trying to live through each season. And that may be one of the most fascinating truths about ancient Egypt. Behind one of history's most majestic civilizations was a daily life that, in its essentials, was deeply human. It was a world of labor and beauty, routine and prayer, hardship and resilience. It was a world where ordinary people rose with the sun, worked beneath its heat, and trusted that as long as the Nile returned and order held, life would go on. For all the splendor of temples, palaces, and royal processions, one subject stood at the very center of Egyptian thought with unusual persistence: death and what came after it. Ancient Egyptians did not see death as a sudden end into nothingness. Instead, they imagined it as a passage, a transformation, and a journey that required preparation. This belief shaped tombs, rituals, prayers, art, and even the way people thought about memory itself. It is one of the main reasons Egypt has remained so vivid in the modern imagination. No other ancient civilization left behind such a powerful and detailed record of how deeply it cared for the dead. Yet this concern was not gloomy in the way it may first appear. For the Egyptians, care for the dead was also a way of protecting life, preserving identity, and giving hope that existence could continue beyond the grave. To understand this world, it helps to begin with the Egyptian view of the human person. Ancient Egyptians did not think of a person as made of just one simple soul. Instead, they imagined several different aspects of human existence working together. Among these were the body, the name, the shadow, the Kai, and the Ba. The body had to be preserved because it remained the physical anchor of identity. The name had to be remembered and spoken because to lose one's name was to risk being forgotten entirely. The Ka is often described as a kind of life force or spiritual double that continued after death and still required nourishment through offerings. The Ba is harder to define neatly, but it is often thought of as a mobile aspect of the person, something like personality or spiritual individuality, able to move between worlds. These ideas may seem complex, but together they show one clear truth. Survival after death required more than simple burial. It required protection, ritual, memory, and ongoing care. Because the body mattered so much, Egyptian burial practices became increasingly elaborate over time. In the dry desert climate, bodies buried naturally in the sand could remain preserved surprisingly well. This may have helped shape the early Egyptian realization that physical preservation was important for life after death. Over time, natural preservation gave way to deliberate preservation, and that is where mummification emerged as one of the most famous Egyptian practices. Mummification was not performed in exactly the same way for all people or in all periods, but its basic aim remained constant: to preserve the body so that the person could continue to exist properly in the next world. The process of mummification was both technical and sacred. Specialists removed organs, treated the body with drying substances such as natron, wrapped it carefully in linen, and included amulets or protective objects within the layers. The heart was often left inside the body because it was believed to be central to thought, emotion, and moral identity. The brain, by contrast, was not valued in the same way and was sometimes removed and discarded. This difference reminds us that Egyptian ideas about the body were not the same as modern biology. What mattered was not anatomical science in our sense, but spiritual function. The wrapped body, protected and transformed through ritual, became ready for burial and rebirth. Organs removed during mummification were often stored in special containers, known as canopic jars. These jars were associated with protective deities and formed part of the larger effort to safeguard the deceased. The tomb itself would then be filled with goods needed for the next life. Food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, tools, and symbolic objects might all be placed within it. In royal or elite tombs, this accumulation could be immense. To modern eyes, such burials may look like displays of wealth, and they were certainly that in part, but to the Egyptians, they also served a practical afterlife purpose. The dead person was not imagined as gone beyond all need. They were imagined as continuing in another form of existence, still requiring support, still needing identity and protection. One of the most striking aspects of Egyptian belief is that the afterlife was often imagined in familiar terms. It was not simply a vague spiritual realm. It could resemble an idealized Egypt, a perfected continuation of earthly existence. Fields, water, food, companionship, and activity all remained possible there. The dead hoped to enter a blessed realm, sometimes called the Field of Reeds, a place of abundance and peace. This helps explain why tomb scenes so often show activities from ordinary life: farming, boating, feasting, music, servants, and offerings. These were not only memories of what had been enjoyed in life, they were also images of what might continue in eternity. But entry into this blessed existence was not automatic. The soul had to face judgment. One of the most famous scenes in Egyptian religion is the weighing of the heart. In this judgment, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was balanced and pure, the person could pass into the next world. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, the consequences were terrible. In some depictions, a monstrous being waits nearby to devour the unworthy. This scene reveals something profound about Egyptian morality. The afterlife was not based only on status, wealth, or ritual performance. Conduct mattered, truth mattered, justice mattered. To live properly within the order of the world had eternal consequences. Texts placed in tombs were meant to help the dead succeed in this journey. Over time, Egyptians developed a large body of funerary literature. In the Old Kingdom, sacred utterances known today as the pyramid texts were inscribed in royal tombs. Later came the coffin texts, which were used more broadly by elites. Eventually, funerary spells became widely known in the form often called the Book of the Dead, though this modern title can be misleading because it was not a single fixed book in the modern sense. Rather, it was a collection of spells, prayers, instructions, and formulas designed to guide and protect the deceased. These texts could help avoid dangers, open gates, identify gods, and provide the words needed to pass judgment successfully. In a world where names and speech had power, knowing the right words could make the difference between danger and salvation. This is why writing was so essential in burial culture. A painted coffin, a carved wall, or a written spell was not merely decorative, it was active. It did something. Egyptian hieroglyphs were believed to hold force, and images themselves could be effective. A painted loaf of bread or a carved offering table was not only a picture. In the logic of Egyptian tombs, representation could help sustain reality. This may seem strange from a modern perspective, but it fits perfectly within the larger Egyptian belief that memory, speech, and symbol helped hold the world together. In death as in life, order depended on proper form. Royal tombs, of course, reached the greatest scale and complexity. In the New Kingdom, many pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings rather than inside giant pyramids. These tombs were cut deep into the rock and decorated with astonishing painted scenes showing gods, sacred journeys, and cosmic renewal. The shift away from visible pyramids toward hidden rock-cut tombs may have reflected changing ideas about security and burial practice. Yet the central concern remained the same. The king had to be protected, guided, and transformed after death. The pharaoh's journey through the underworld mirrored the nightly journey of the sun, which disappeared in darkness and rose again renewed. In this sense, death itself became linked to the daily rebirth of the cosmos. The tomb of Tutankhamun has become the most famous Egyptian burial in the modern world, not because he was the greatest pharaoh, but because his tomb was found relatively intact. The treasures inside gave modern audiences a rare glimpse into the richness of royal burial. Gold, chariots, statues, jewelry, furniture, clothing, and ritual objects all surrounded the king. Most royal tombs had been robbed in antiquity, so Tutankhamun's burial seemed almost miraculous in its survival. Yet it is important to remember that his tomb was only one example of a much wider funerary culture. The wealth of the tomb attracts attention, but behind it lies the deeper Egyptian conviction that death demanded preparation on a grand scale. Even people far from royal wealth still tried to prepare for the afterlife as best they could. They might not afford full mummification or richly painted tombs, but they could still use amulets, prayers, small offerings, or simpler forms of burial. The hope for continued existence was not reserved entirely for kings. Over time, access to afterlife beliefs widened, and more people sought the protections once associated more closely with elite culture. This broadening of religious hope is one of the more human and moving aspects of Egyptian civilization. The desire to survive, to be remembered, and to remain connected to loved ones was shared across social levels. Tombs were also places of memory for the living. Family members visited, brought offerings, spoke names, and maintained the bond with the dead. In this sense, Egyptian burial culture did not create a strict wall between life and death. The dead remained part of the moral and emotional landscape. They could be honored, appealed to, even feared in some cases. Letters to the dead survived from ancient Egypt, showing that people sometimes addressed deceased relatives with requests or complaints, as though the dead still had influence. This reveals how continuous the relationship remained. Death changed a person's condition, but it did not erase them from the social world. There is something deeply touching in this Egyptian refusal to let the dead vanish completely. A person's body was preserved, their name inscribed, their likeness painted, their goods arranged, their soul instructed, and their memory maintained. All of this speaks to a civilization intensely aware of loss yet unwilling to accept oblivion as the final answer. In many ancient societies, death was honored, but in Egypt, it was almost managed with extraordinary detail. Ritual, art, architecture, and theology all combined to create a system through which identity might endure. At the same time, Egyptian burial practices reveal anxiety as much as confidence. The elaborate protections were needed because the afterlife was not simple. There were dangers, obstacles, judges, gates, and unknown forces. Bodies could decay, tombs could be robbed, names could be erased, offerings could stop. For all their belief in continuation, Egyptians knew that survival had to be defended. That is why so much effort went into preserving the conditions for eternal life. Eternity was hoped for, but it had to be carefully built. This tension between hope and danger gives Egyptian religion much of its emotional depth. The dead were not simply assumed to be safe. They were guided, guarded, nourished, and judged. The afterlife was real, but it had to be earned and protected. That made every tomb, every prayer, every wrapped body, and every offering part of a larger struggle against disappearance. In this way, Egyptian funerary culture tells us as much about life as it does about death. It shows what people valued so much that they wanted it to continue forever. Identity, family, order, food, dignity, and the chance to wake again in a world made whole. So when modern people think of mummies, golden masks, and secret tombs, they are seeing only the outer surface of a much deeper belief. Ancient Egypt cared for the dead because it believed that death was not the end of the story. The body could be preserved, the soul could travel, the heart could be judged, the name could survive, and the person could enter a renewed existence if the proper steps were taken. Few civilizations invested so much effort, imagination, and devotion into the question of what happens after life ends, and perhaps that is why Egypt continues to fascinate the world. Its monuments do not merely show power, they show longing. They show a civilization trying with all its skill to hold onto the fragile human self against time, decay, and forgetting. In their tombs and rituals, the Egyptians expressed one of the oldest and deepest human hopes, that something essential in us can endure, and that with enough care, memory, and sacred order, death itself might become the doorway to another dawn. As long and enduring as ancient Egypt was, even this remarkable civilization did not remain unchanged forever. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals shifted, foreign powers arrived, and old traditions were tested again and again. Yet what is striking is not simply that Egypt changed, but that it preserved so much of itself through those changes. For thousands of years, the civilization along the Nile adapted to new rulers, new pressures, and new circumstances, while still holding on to its sense of sacred order, memory, and identity. In its final long centuries, ancient Egypt became a land where continuity and transformation existed side by side. This closing part of the story is not only about decline, it is also about resilience, rediscovery, and the extraordinary legacy Egypt left behind. The period historians call the New Kingdom was one of Egypt's greatest ages of strength, wealth, and visibility. Pharaohs of this era ruled an empire that stretched far beyond the Nile Valley into neighboring lands. Armies marched, tribute flowed in, and royal building reached new heights. The great temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and elsewhere remind us that Egypt was not only old by this time, but still ambitious. Rulers such as Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Seti I, and Rameses II belong to this broad era, and together they reveal how varied Egyptian kingship could be. Some emphasized trade, some conquest, some religious change, and some monumental building, but all operated within a civilization already ancient by their own standards. Hatshepsut remains one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history because she governed not merely as queen or regent, but as pharaoh. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri still stands as one of the most elegant monuments in Egypt, rising in terraces against the cliffs of western Thebes. She presented herself in the language of kingship, using the symbols and visual forms expected of a ruler, even though she was a woman in a role usually held by men. Her reign shows that Egyptian political tradition could sometimes be more flexible than it first appears. At the same time, the effort later made to erase or reduce her memory suggests how strongly later generations tried to restore familiar patterns of legitimacy. Egypt could adapt, but it also guarded its traditions closely. Thutmose III, often remembered as one of Egypt's greatest military rulers, expanded Egyptian influence through campaigns in the Levant and beyond. Under kings like him, Egypt was no longer only a river civilization defending its fertile strip of land. It had become an imperial power engaged in diplomacy, warfare, tribute systems, and international exchange. Luxury goods, foreign captives, exotic animals, and new materials reached Egypt from distant regions. This wider contact brought wealth and knowledge, but it also drew Egypt into the shifting politics of a larger world. No civilization can grow into an empire without becoming more exposed to external pressures, and in time, that exposure would matter greatly. Amenhotep III ruled during a period of enormous royal display and artistic richness. Statues, palaces, and temples flourished, and Egypt projected confidence. Then came one of the most unusual episodes in Egyptian history, the reign of Akhenaten. He attempted a dramatic religious shift centered on the Aten, often represented as the visible sun disk. Artistic styles changed, traditional gods were challenged, and the royal court moved to a new capital, Akhetaten. For a moment, Egypt seemed to turn away from deeply rooted forms of worship and sacred imagery. Yet after Akhenaten's death, much of this experiment was undone. Traditional cults were restored, old gods returned to prominence, and the memory of Akhenaten was often treated with hostility. This reversal shows how powerful Egyptian conservatism remained. Innovation could happen, but permanence depended on alignment with the broader structure of Egyptian religious life. Tutankhamun is perhaps the most famous pharaoh today, though his own reign was relatively short and politically less significant than those of many other rulers. His modern fame comes largely from the discovery of his tomb in 1922, which offered the world an astonishing glimpse into royal burial. The gold mask, nested coffins, jewelry, chariots, furniture, and ceremonial objects all helped shape the modern image of ancient Egypt as a civilization of splendor and mystery. Yet Tutankhamun's true historical importance may lie more in what his reign represents. The restoration of traditional religion after the upheaval of Akhenaten's reforms. In that sense, he stands at the turning point between radical change and the return of continuity. Later rulers such as Seti I and Ramesses II brought Egypt back into a mode of monumental state power. Ramesses II, in particular, became one of the most celebrated pharaohs of all time. His reign was long, and his building projects were vast. Colossal statues, temple facades, and inscriptions proclaimed his victories and piety across the land. At Abu Simbel, his great rock-cut temples still dominate the landscape with theatrical grandeur. Ramesses II understood something central to Egyptian kingship. That power had to be seen, carved, and remembered. Monuments were not just celebrations of success. They were tools of immortality, ensuring that the king's name would continue to live in stone. But even in these great centuries, the pressures were growing. Maintaining empire required resources. Foreign threats became more serious. Internal power could shift toward priests, military leaders, and regional authorities. The late New Kingdom and the periods that followed were marked by fragmentation, recovery, and renewed instability. Egypt did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it passed through cycles of weakening and restoration. Libyan dynasties ruled. Nubian rulers from Kush conquered and revived aspects of Egyptian kingship. Assyrians invaded. Persians took control. At times, Egypt regained independence, but it was increasingly part of a larger and more competitive international world. This long sequence of change reveals an important truth. Ancient Egypt's greatest challenge was not simply internal decline, but the fact that it existed for so long that the world around it changed repeatedly. New powers arose with different military systems, broader empires, and shifting trade networks. Egypt was no longer isolated enough to rely only on the defensive strength of desert, river, and tradition. It had to respond to imperial forces larger than any it had faced in earlier ages. That it survived these pressures for as long as it did is itself a sign of exceptional resilience. One of the most transformative moments came in 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great entered Egypt. To the Egyptians, he could be welcomed, not merely as a conqueror, but as a new ruler who fit into the long tradition of kingship. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. This was a fascinating new phase. Egypt remained Egypt in many ways, with temples, priests, and ancient rituals continuing, but it also became a center of Hellenistic culture. Greek language, art, administration, and scholarship flourished, especially in Alexandria, the great city founded by Alexander. Alexandria became one of the most famous cities of the ancient world. It was home to the Great Library of Alexandria and the Museion, institutions associated with scholarship, learning, and the collection of knowledge. Philosophers, mathematicians, poets, and scientists gathered there. In this new Mediterranean setting, Egypt was no longer only the land of pharaohs and temples. It was also a crossroads of ideas, trade, and intellectual ambition. Yet even here, the old traditions remained alive. Egyptian religion continued. Temples were still built. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian contexts, understanding that to rule Egypt properly, they had to participate in its ancient symbolic world. The most famous ruler of this last phase is Cleopatra VII. Modern imagination often turns her into a figure of romance alone, but she was also a skilled and politically intelligent ruler navigating a dangerous world dominated by Rome. She spoke multiple languages and understood that Egypt's survival depended on diplomacy, wealth, and strategic alliances. Her story became entangled with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. But beneath that drama lay the larger reality that Egypt was facing the expanding power of Rome, which by then overshadowed much of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's defeat, followed by the Roman annexation of Egypt in 30 BCE, marked the formal end of pharaonic rule. Even under Rome, however, Egypt did not vanish overnight. Temples functioned for centuries. Priestly traditions continued in places. Hieroglyphic writing survived longer than many people realize, though it gradually faded from living use. Christianity later spread through Egypt, and over time, the religious world of the pharaohs receded, yet its memory endured in monuments, buried objects, ruined temples, and unread inscriptions waiting silently across the landscape. For many centuries, much of ancient Egyptian writing was no longer understood. The statues remained, the tombs remained, the pyramids remained, but the voices carved into stone had fallen silent. Then, in the modern age, those voices began to return. One of the great turning points in rediscovering ancient Egypt came with the decipherment of hieroglyphs in the 19th century. The Rosetta Stone, bearing the same text in multiple scripts, allowed scholars such as Jean-François Champollion to unlock the ancient writing system. Suddenly, Egypt was no longer only a land of mysterious images. It became a civilization that could speak again through its own records. Royal names, religious hymns, administrative texts, letters, tomb inscriptions, and literary works all became accessible. This changed everything. Egypt was no longer interpreted only from the outside. It could be read from within. Archaeology deepened that rediscovery. Tombs, temples, settlements, papyri, statues, and everyday objects gradually built a fuller picture of Egyptian life. Discoveries such as the tomb of Tutankhamun captured public imagination, but countless less famous finds have been equally important in understanding the civilization. Through archaeology, Egypt became both more majestic and more human. We learned not only about pharaohs and gods, but also about workers' villages, family letters, school exercises, medical texts, tax records, and ordinary households. The civilization became richer precisely because it became less distant. What then is the true legacy of ancient Egypt? It is certainly visible in its monuments. The pyramids remain among the most iconic structures on Earth. The temples still astonish with their scale and detail. Egyptian art, with its clarity of line and symbolic power, remains instantly recognizable. But the deeper legacy lies in something more enduring than stone alone. Ancient Egypt shows what a civilization can become when it builds itself around continuity, memory, sacred order, and confidence in long duration. It reminds us that human beings have always sought permanence in a fragile world. They have always feared oblivion and answered it with ritual, architecture, writing, and story. Egypt also leaves behind a legacy of fascination. Across centuries, artists, writers, filmmakers, travelers, and historians have returned to it again and again. Part of that fascination comes from mystery, but part comes from recognition. In Egypt, we see concerns that are still our own: how to govern, how to remember, how to live well, how to face death, how to make beauty last, and how to preserve meaning across time. The Egyptians asked these questions on a monumental scale, but they are still human questions. That is why their civilization continues to feel alive. In the end, ancient Egypt was never just the land of pyramids, nor only the land of pharaohs and tombs. It was a world shaped by a river, sustained by farmers, organized by scribes, enriched by craftsmen, guarded by priests, and imagined through stories of gods and eternity. It was a civilization of daily labor and cosmic ambition, of mud brick houses and golden shrines, of passing dynasties and astonishing permanence. Few societies have left behind such a complete union of power, beauty, ritual, and endurance. And perhaps that is the calm, final wonder of ancient Egypt. Though its rulers are gone and its temples stand partly in ruin, it still has the power to quiet the mind and stretch the imagination across immense spans of time. It reminds us that thousands of years before the modern world, people stood beside the Nile and believed that order could be protected, memory could be preserved, and life could be tied to something eternal. They built with that belief, buried with that belief, ruled with that belief, and passed it forward in stone. Because of that, ancient Egypt did not truly disappear. It became one of humanity's longest echoes, still speaking softly across the ages.